I want to thank everyone for coming out tonight. My name is Itzi Ramirez, and I'll be the moderator for the panel discussion tonight. I just want to quickly introduce Platypus for those of you who might not be familiar with the project. The Platypus Affiliated Society organizes reading groups, public fora, research, and journalism focused on problems and tasks inherited from the old 1920s to 30s, new 1960s to 70s, and post-political 1980s to 90s left for the possibility of emancipatory politics today. The title for the panel tonight is Left Perspectives on the Israeli-Palestinian Conflict. The panel description is as follows. How should the left understand the present crisis in Israel-Palestine and the Middle East, its origins and its historical meaning? What role has the left had in shaping these conditions, whether positively or negatively? Is there a left-wing alternative to the present escalation of bloodshed? If yes, what? If not, why not? What are the goals of the left in the broader Middle East? How do these relate to the tasks facing the left here? Which way forward for Palestinian liberation? Each panelist will give 10-minute opening remarks, followed by 2 to 4-minute responses to each other. Then we'll open up the floor for Q&A and then closing remarks. I'll introduce the panelists in order that they'll be speaking. William Ayers, Distinguished Professor of Education and Senior University Scholar at the University of Illinois at Chicago, who's now retired, has written extensively about social justice and democracy, education, and the cultural context of schooling and teaching as an essentially intellectual, ethical, and political enterprise. His books include Teaching Toward Freedom, Fugitive Days, a memoir, Public Enemy, Confessions of an American Dissident, To Teach, The Journey, and Comics and Demand the Impossible. Gabriel Schat. Gabriel is a PhD student in Northwestern's philosophy department. His interests primarily concern metaphysical and epistemological issues in Marxism and German metaphysics more broadly. He has been involved in various left-wing parties and projects over the course of his life. And then finally, we'll have Tony Michels. Tony Michels teaches American Jewish history at the University of Wisconsin-Madison. He is the author of A Fire in Their Hearts, Yiddish Socialists in New York, editor of Jewish Radicals, a documentary history, and is currently finishing a book with the working title Jews and Revolution, From the United States to Russia and Back. And if you're interested in some of the activity that Platypus organizes and puts on, you can ask Ben Katz about the activities on campus after the panel. So without further ado, we'll start the opening remarks with Bill.
Okay, I will start. I do not have 10 minutes of opening remarks, but I think we're all aware that we're witnessing a pre-planned, pre-announced genocide in Gaza. The crisis couldn't be more intense and more urgent. And we in the United States have a particular role to play, and that is because without the imperial enablers, mainly the United States, but also Great Britain and others, Israel could not exist as it does and would not go on. The United States has allowed and funded the ongoing war since really before 1948, but certainly starting in 1948. And when I say a pre-announced genocide, I'm urging you to go back and read the statements of the war cabinet in Israel after October 7th. They were very clear that they were not fighting a normal human force. They said, among other things, the defense secretary said these are human animals. They said that Gaza would be made into a wasteland. That was announced. And they said they were going to starve the people of Gaza, and they are. And so the idea that this is some kind of a war, the way we're getting our information in this country is pathetic, if not absolutely obscene, because the whole narrative that says the war started on October 7th, that's a lie, that's a myth. The idea that because the reason they've had to bomb and destroy every hospital and every medical clinic is because there were Hamas people hiding there is wrong and a lie. The fact that they've killed 2 college presidents, 12 professors, countless journalists, without any free, independent news source being allowed into Gaza. The only people in Gaza are what we call in the United States embedded. That is, they allow journalists to go in if they go in a IDF jeep or an IDF personnel carrier. So we are being lied to. Our government, our taxes, our resources are being used to obliterate the Palestinian people. 38,000 dead already. Today is the anniversary. Today is March 7th, so it's the 5th anniversary of this total assault on the people of Gaza, on the Palestinians. And Itzi asks, where do we go from here? What's the solution? In the United States, and one thing I think is hopeful in the United States is that the Palestinian community in general, Students for Justice in Palestine, Jewish Voice for Peace, have been relentless and have been fast acting, so that 5 months in, it's already entered the public discussion, what's going on, in spite of the fact we're not only being lied to, but we're being, and the narrative is one constant lie. I mean, even the most benign people, NPR yesterday, I heard somebody saying, well, this is a conflict that goes back centuries. It's not true. It's absolutely not true. And the idea that somehow that it's just age old, you can't end it, it's nonsense. It begins with, it begins way back, but it does also begin with the imperial decision, Great Britain, the Balfour Declaration, 1917. It begins there, and the idea of creating a nation sanctified by the United Nations in a land that was already occupied, with the myth that it was a people without land and a land without people. That's the same myth that the United States tells itself about the genocide against Native Americans. The only solution, yes, we must, all of us in this room, all of us in this community, all of us in this country, must call for an immediate ceasefire. Biden's going to call for a 6-week ceasefire tonight. Not enough. We need a permanent ceasefire. The killing has to stop. The genocide has to end. And long term, the United States should stop funding Israel altogether. Certainly it should stop funding the military. And the only way there's going to be a solution on a country that's built on ethnic cleansing, on racism. I mean, I brought a few books I wanted to recommend to you all, but I have to mention one in particular, which I just read and floored me, which is by a Jewish writer in Jerusalem named Nathan Thrall. And the book is called A Day in the Life of Abed Salama. If you've not read it, you really should read it. If you want to see what apartheid looks like from the ground up, if you want to see what it looks like in granular detail, look at A Day in the Life of Abed Salama, whose son, 5-year-old son, was in a bus accident, and it took him 38 hours to get to his son because of the ID cards, because of the roads you're not allowed to travel, because of the checkpoints. This is apartheid. This is racism. It's the state of Israel is built on this. It's ethnic cleansing. The only solution long term is a secular democratic state. Now, somehow the Biden administration has pulled out of the bottom drawer the 2-state solution. That was dead in Oslo. It was dead before Oslo. It was dead as soon as they decided that they were going to allow settlements, and the United States would turn a blind eye. The United States exports not just the big military stuff, the tanks and the air weaponry, but they export assault rifles and pistols, which are used by settlers in the West Bank to kill Palestinians and to take their land. The only solution, long term, is a secular, democratic place from the river to the sea.
Thank you, comrade. And good evening, everyone, and thank you all for coming out. So I feel a little bit out of place here because I'm not a historian and I'm not an expert in the Middle East or any related matters.
That makes you right in. You and I are together.
Yeah. But and also, I should add, I find myself a little bit confused by the questions posed to this panel. I'm not sure I know how to answer most of them, and I'm not sure there would be much point in me trying to answer them. For example, one of the questions is, what are the goals of the left in the broader Middle East? But far be it for me, an American, to tell leftists in the Middle East what their goals should be.
Right on.
However, if there are any representatives from left-wing movements in the Middle East here today, we would all love to hear from you, I'm sure. So, in any case, I will respond to a different question than those asked of the panel. Today, I will do my best to explain what I think the meaning of the so-called Israel-Palestine conflict is for those in the United States who want to dismantle U.S. imperialism and are organizing to build a better world and a livable tomorrow. I want to begin this by laying out a couple of basic points that I think shouldn't be controversial, at least amongst this audience. One, the Palestinian struggle is an anti-colonial struggle of national liberation. Two, the State of Israel is a crucial ally of U.S. imperialism and an indispensable element in the U.S.'s imperial strategy in the Middle East. To elucidate these claims, I did prepare a couple of quotations from the International Court of Justice's recent order against the State of Israel in South Africa's case against Israel that it brought to the ICJ. Briefly, the ICJ quotes UN Under-Secretary General for Humanitarian Affairs and Emergency Relief, Mr. Martin Griffiths, on 5 January 2024. This is an abbreviated quote. Gaza has become a place of death and despair. Families are sleeping in the open as temperatures plummet. Areas where civilians were told to relocate for their safety have come under bombardment. Medical facilities are under relentless attack. A public health disaster is unfolding. Infectious diseases are spreading in overcrowded shelters as sewers spill over. Famine is around the corner. Gaza has simply become uninhabitable. As it happens, I also reproduced the quote that Mr. Ayers mentioned. The ICJ also makes reference to this quote as well as several others which do seem to show genocidal intent on the part of senior Israeli officials. On 9 October 2023, Mr. Yoav Gallant, Defense Minister of Israel, announced that he had ordered a complete siege of Gaza City and that there would be, quote, no electricity, no food, no fuel, and that everything was closed. On the following day, Minister Gallant stated, speaking to Israeli troops on the Gaza border, I have released all restraints. You saw what we are fighting against. We are fighting human animals, and so on. Now, we can see from this that Israel is not fighting a military organization, but is in fact fighting the entire population of Gaza, a population that Israel's senior military and political leadership regards as human animals. Now, as horrific and disturbing as these things are, we shouldn't be surprised because these are in fact a logical result of the political project to which Israel is committed. If you'll indulge me again, I quote now from Dr. Norman Finkelstein's book, Image and Reality of the Israel-Palestine Conflict, the second edition, pages 13 to 14. He says, quote, modern anti-Semitism combined two conceptually distinguishable, if in practice overlapping discourses, each of which disputed from a different angle the liberal understanding of the relationship between nation and state. One, a political discourse which suggested that the state/political superstructure belonged not to its citizens, but to the nation with a numerical majority. This was the basic contention of romantic anti-Semites such as Fichte in Germany. Two, a topographic discourse which suggested that the state/territorial unit belonged not to its inhabitants per se, but only to the nation, organic community that could establish a singular, historical, spiritual connection with it. Dr. Finkelstein continues that Zionism replicated the reasoning of the anti-Semitic political discourse and followed its logic to conclude that the resolution of the Jewish question required a polity belonging to the Jewish nation. In effect, Zionism also replicated the reasoning of the anti-Semitic topographic discourse in reaching the conclusion that resettling Jewry's historical homeland was the way to resolve the Jewish question. Now, given that Palestine was already home to an indigenous population of several million, it is clear how this entails the genocidal practices and statements we are seeing today. Now, to return to my two basic points earlier about the basic points I mentioned earlier, I hope it is clear why I call the Palestinian struggle an anti-colonial struggle, and we can also add that it is an existential struggle for the Palestinian people. As for my second point, I don't really have time to defend this claim in detail, but I don't think it should be controversial to anyone who has paid much attention to the US practices in the Middle East over the last few decades. Now, the main thing that I want to communicate today, what is the meaning of these above two basic points for the US left? I think this meaning can only be understood in terms of a practical orientation for us. I think our practical orientation should be guided by two concepts that used to be very important for the left. The first is the concept of internationalism, and the second is that of revolutionary defeatism. What is internationalism? It is solidarity of all progressive struggles with all other progressive struggles around the world. The proletariat is an international class and has an objective interest in overcoming the vicious national, ethnic, and racial divisions wrought by capitalism and imperialism. Moreover, these struggles in all parts of the world are connected and depend on one another. And this is why we are internationalists. But what does it mean to be in solidarity? Does it mean that we declare our goodwill? Does it mean that we butt our noses into progressive movements in other parts of the world and opine about what they ought to do and how they ought to be? I do not think it means either of these things. Instead, I think it means that we do our duty to the global struggle for a better tomorrow. What this means is that we need to advance the revolutionary struggle in our particular context. This, in fact, is the highest form of solidarity. For those of us located in the belly of the beast of the world imperial system, this orientation is especially important. Our foremost responsibility is to take the most effective possible concrete material action to advance the struggle in the US and to weaken US imperialism from within. What about revolutionary defeatism? This concept emerged from the communist movement during World War I. The Russian Bolsheviks put forward this slogan as a practical guide to communists around the world. What it meant is that communists should not look at World War I and ask themselves which imperial bloc is better or morally preferable. Rather, communists should seek to exploit, for the purposes of advancing revolution at home, the inevitable divisions and crises within their domestic bourgeoisie that inter-imperial war inevitably precipitates. The point was to turn imperial world war into revolutionary civil war. I think this concept is still relevant today, but I like to update the terminology. In our current US context, I call it the concept of kicking them while they're down. By this, I mean that right now, US imperialism is on the back foot. We can see all over the world that the US is losing its hegemonic grip on the planet. We can also already see that this is beginning to cause splits and crises within our ruling cliques. In other words, our bourgeoisie is a little down these days, and we should do everything we can to get them further down, and then we should kick them. This is the meaning of the second of the above 2 points. Because Israel is so important to US imperial strategy, the Palestinian liberation struggle is like a dagger in the side of the US imperialism. We should do everything we can to drive that dagger deeper. As a great comrade once said, "There is great chaos under heaven. The situation is excellent." The most urgent task facing the US left is to build a vanguard party of the working class that is up to the task of waging class warfare, eliminating all forms of racial and gender oppression, and building socialism in the US. It is only by doing this that we can respond to the meaning of Palestine. It is only by accomplishing this that we can be in real solidarity with Palestine and all progressive struggles around the world. And it is only by doing this that we can take advantage of the crises that will result from the collapse of US imperialism. We do not currently have a revolutionary vanguard party in the United States, but there are concrete things that everyone can do, starting today, to contribute to this great task. It begins by understanding your social position and your immediate context. Study revolutionary theory and the history of our struggle. Listen to our revolutionary elders and learn from their accomplishments and mistakes. Talk to others around you and start organizing and campaigning with discipline in your immediate context. These many loci of activity are a prerequisite for the emergence of a movement and the building of a party. Clouds are building, and we are each droplets of water. We all have a duty to leave the clouds and fall from heaven. Together we can bring the flood to earth. Thank you.
I was asked to speak as an historian, and particularly on the pre-1948 American left and Jews in their relationship to Zionism. So in 8 to 10 minutes, I'm going to try to do that and say whatever comments I might have about the contemporary situation in the United States later on. So the subject, as I see it, has two parts. One has to do with Jews in the left in the United States, so it's internally within the Jewish community, and then the left more broadly in its relationship to the question of Zionism up to 1948. So I'll start with the first part. Zion, and I'm going to talk about the Zionist left specifically. Zionism is a broad movement taking on various forms, putting forward different goals. The Zionist left, which is say socialist Zionists, of which there were several varieties, emerged in the early 1900s in the Russian Empire in response to, well, there goes my stopwatch. And emerged in the early 1900s in response to a particular situation. The situation of Russian Jews that produced Zionism and several other parties, also all trying to respond to the set of circumstances I'm referring to, was a combination of increasing cycles of violence against Jews, pogroms, that were taking on ever greater dimensions since the 1870s, 1880s, and poverty, increasing poverty that plagued the Russian Jewish population. The Russian Jewish population was numbered about 5 million around 1900, and it was the largest Jewish community in the world at that time. So this was the problem: increasing poverty and increasing violence. How to understand why this was happening was a matter of great debate in what was emerging as a large popular Jewish workers movement, and then what to do about it. The solutions that were put forward were basically this, for the most part, within the Jewish community of Russia. One, organize a Jewish revolutionary party that sought to both overthrow the Tsar and secure Jewish national rights in Russia. Right? So it was a combination of Marxism and a kind of non-territorial nationalism, which is, say, a nationalism based on culture. And that was represented by a party called the Bund. The Bund was quite popular in the Jewish community, but reviled by the Russian Social Democratic Party, both the Bolshevik, especially the Bolshevik faction, and also the Mensheviks, terms that might mean something to some of the people in the audience. The Mensheviks rejected it as well. So that was one solution. Again, a combination of Marxism and this kind of cultural nationalism that demanded, when I say national rights, autonomy for the Jewish community in a future democratic Russia. Second solution offered was that Jews needed to evacuate Russia because their situation was getting worse and could not get better, and was getting worse, and therefore Jews needed to evacuate. Second position. That second position then had two different positions that came out of that analysis, that the future of Jews in Russia was perilous and hopeless. And that was one, that Jews need a territory somewhere. The other was that Jews needed a territory in Palestine. So two responses that were not wholly unrelated. The question was, where should that territory be? So emigration, territory, where should the territory be? And then the question became, what future, if you say, for those who chose Palestine as the option, then the question became, what kind of economy should be created? What kind of political form Jewish national rights should take? Should it take, for instance, if you choose for socialism, should it be constructive, which is to build the foundations of a social society, or should it be based on class conflict, which is to say that capitalism would develop in Palestine and Jews would take part in a class struggle that would overthrow capitalism in Palestine? As far as the question of a political form went, the question there was whether Jews should strive for some form of autonomy, but not a state, or a state that was predominantly Jewish, or a state that was binational, which is to say Arab and Jewish, binational, meaning that both nations would have political sovereignty together jointly in Palestine. Or should should Palestine be partitioned into some joint or partitioned into an Arab state predominantly and a predominantly Jewish state? Those were the competing ideas, and I should say these ideas evolved from decade to decade. They evolved in competition with one another. All these ideas were transplanted to the United States by Russian Jewish immigrants and other Jewish immigrants from around Eastern Europe. The level of support for these ideas grew from decade to decade, from the early 1900s to 1948. It grew in support because almost in direct correspondence to events in several places, but especially in Europe. Again, let me refer to the rising cycles of violence, the pogroms that escalated. Second, the Russian Revolution. And in the course of the revolution, there was a tremendous, in the chaos of 1918 to 1921, Jews were slaughtered on a mass scale. Anywhere, according to historians, between 100 and 200,000 Jews were slaughtered, and that doesn't even go into the amount of violence of all sorts. So that was the crowning, if that's not the right word, crowning, the culmination of the kind of violence I'm talking about. The next round, of course, would be the Holocaust. So in response to this kind of violence, up to about 1921, Zionism grew in popularity as a solution to the twin problems of capitalism and anti-Semitism that I described before. The Soviet Union put forward a new solution to the Jewish question. It was anti-Zionist at first. We'll get to this later, and then offered various solutions, some of which were territorial in nature, meaning that Jews who were greatly impoverished and dislocated coming out of World War I were settled, some of whom were settled on colonies in Ukraine, Crimea, and ultimately the Jewish autonomous region of the Soviet Far East. So you could have a situation, there was a situation in left-wing Zionists supported both the Bolshevik Revolution and the project of building some sort of Jewish homeland in Palestine, because both were built on territorial solutions. And again, we're talking about people who are socialists anyway. So that's another impetus to support the Bolshevik Revolution. So that's a turning point. The support for Zionism grew into the 40s, and it grew again in response to these crises. Now, when I say support for Zionism grew, this means two things. One, many people on the left came to be socialist Zionists. Two, there were many who did not consider themselves Zionists, but they believed there should be a territorial settlement somewhere or in multiple places for Jews to solve the kinds of problems that I've been describing. So that's a distinction that meant something at one time. The distinction between non-Zionists people who were not Zionists, but people who were not anti-Zionists, and people who were Zionists. But there was that kind of growing common ground until the 1940s, when Jewish statehood, side by side with the creation of an Arab state, the UN Partition Plan of November 1947 came to have virtually universal support in the Jewish community. Let me quickly shift to the general left. The general left in this period, first of all, the question of Palestine or Zionism was not an important issue for multiple decades. You can understand perhaps why. This is a small movement in a small corner of the world, and there were many other higher priorities to address. I'm talking about the 1900s, the 1910s, the 1920s. It begins to be an issue for the left in 1929, when there was widespread riots in Palestine. The Communist Party, Communist Party weighs in on this under orders from the Comintern to very quickly. The first reaction of the Communist Party of these are terrible pogroms against Jews, and then the party abruptly said these are not terrible pogroms against Jews. This is an anti-imperialist uprising, and we should support it. This set off a firestorm within the left, but we don't need to go into that. It becomes an issue again of some concern to the left between 36 and 39, when there's the Great Arab Revolt that drew some attention of the American left onto Palestine again. But it really doesn't become a major issue for the left until the 40s, and especially after the war. Then it's, of course, a very pressing issue because of the Holocaust and because there's escalating violence in Palestine. There's a three-way conflict happening in which the Jewish community of Palestine was waging an armed struggle against England. And there's also conflict between the Arab community in England and between Jews and Arabs, all going on in the 40s. I'll quickly tell you what the major left-wing parties in the United States, the positions they took on the issue in the 40s. First, the largest party was the Communist Party. The Communist Party went from the 1920s, especially 1929, from calling Zionism a form of fascism to the 1940s to calling Zionism as a form of anti-fascism. By 1942, this was starting in 41-42, not by 1942, but in 41-42, this became the official communist position that Zionism is a form of anti-fascism and communists should support it, as well as the development of the Jewish community in Palestine, but it did not call for Jewish statehood in Palestine. By 1947, when partition is on the table, and the partition plan is on the table because the Soviet Union, not the United States, Soviet Union put it on the table. The U.S. waffled on this issue. The U.S. was really not sure whether it wanted to see a Jewish state in Palestine. We can get to that later. But the Soviet Union put it on the table. When the prospect of a Jewish state became real, the Communist Party actively and vigorously supported the establishment of a Jewish state and an Arab state side by side. That's the communist position at 47-48. The Trotskyist Socialist Workers' Party took a different position. The Socialist Workers' Party's official position was that Jews have no national rights in Palestine, that any assertion of Jewish national rights in Palestine is by definition an infringement on Arab national rights and should not be supported. Not all its members thought this way, but I'm talking about the official position of the party. The third party worth mentioning is the Workers' Party. This is another Trotskyist party that had split off from the Socialist Workers' Party in 1940. Socialist Workers' Party went from being anti-Zionist going into the 40s to being what I would call non-Zionist by 46, 47, which is to say Jews have legitimate national rights in Palestine, and Jewish refugees should be allowed to immigrate there unrestricted. This is in opposition to the British policy of closing off immigration to Palestine. In 1939, England announced that there were 5 years left of immigration of Jews to Palestine, and then it would end. So the non-Zionist position coming out of the war is that there should be unrestricted immigration of Jews to Palestine. They have some national rights there. but not necessarily independent state, political sovereignty or statehood. After the partition plan, the Workers' Party endorses statehood, but with the hope that it would be transitional, and that what would replace it eventually was an Arab-Jewish socialist federation throughout the Middle East. Or to put it differently, a socialist federation throughout the Middle East in which Jews would have equal national rights. And that's it.
Perfect. Well timed.
I'm sorry, I think I might have gone over 10 minutes.
It was good.
Now we'll have like 2 to 4 minute responses to each other. We'll start with Phil.
Oh, I don't have 2 minutes. I would just say that really interesting history, but I'll just underline 2 points that Gabriel made. One is that I too was confused by the opening question, because I think that our responsibility as American leftists is to deal with our own imperialism. That's our job. And when we look around the world, if we are internationalists, we are drawn to struggles that are against imperialism, that are part of the international struggle for world, revolution, world socialism. And that means assuming that as Americans, our job is here with dealing with our own imperial government, and our job is to support self-determination for the Palestinian people.
Yeah, super. Thank you. So I, again, not a historian here, but thank you, Tony. I do have a couple of questions, though, about, I don't know, perhaps the framing here. And in much of the first part of your presentation, it sounded like you were presenting the growth of the Zionist movement as a sort of natural outcome of violence directed at Jewish people in Europe, and then, of course, the Holocaust. Although really, even I think maybe the relevant time to focus on here is the pre-World War II time, which you also portrayed as a growth in the Zionist movement emerging as a natural consequence of this violence. And my concern about that is that it sort of elides what could be some distinct different class interests within the Jewish community. So I would be curious about, is the Zionist project really a project of all Jewish people? What are the class interests, and who are the specific sectors really pushing this ideology? And then the second thing is, so I want to just draw attention to this thing from Dr. Finkelstein that I quoted about how Zionism, in fact, reproduces these two discourses of anti-Semitism. And I can read it again if you want, but I didn't hear you say anything that contradicted Mr. Finkelstein's point. So, yeah, okay, sure. According to Dr. Finkelstein, modern anti-Semitism combined two conceptually distinguishable, if in practice overlapping discourses, each of which disputed from a different angle the liberal understanding of the relationship between nation and state. One, a political discourse which suggested that the state/political superstructure belonged not to its citizens, but to the nation, organic community, with the numerical majority. This was the basic contention of romantic anti-Semites such as Fichte in Germany. Two, a topographic discourse which suggested that the state/territorial unit belonged not to its inhabitants per se, but only to the nation, organic community, that could establish a singular historical spiritual connection with it. This was the basic contention of the Romantics, as well as the integral anti-Semites such as Barré in France. Mr. Finkelstein continues, we have already seen that Zionism replicated the reasoning of the anti-Semitic political discourse and followed its logic to conclude that the resolution of the Jewish question required a polity, quote, belonging to the Jewish nation. In effect, Zionism also replicated the reasoning of the anti-Semitic topographic discourse in reaching the conclusion that resettling Jewry in its historical, organic, integral, etc. homeland was the way to resolve the Jewish question. Image and Reality, 2nd edition, pages 13 to 14. So I'm sure it's been 4 minutes.
Yeah.
Those are my two questions. One about the class interests within Zionism and the replication of these discourses.
And I would just say, just again, as on an historical note, the U.S. did not arm Israel in 1948. The U.S. had an arms embargo on the entire Middle East in 1948. There were efforts to smuggle weapons in from the United States. That's an interesting story in and of itself. But England armed Egypt and Jordan. Israel didn't arm anybody. I mean, the U.S. didn't arm anybody. And Israel obtained its arms, its heavy weaponry from communist Czechoslovakia. Again, this connects to what I was saying before about the role of the Soviet Union in establishing the state of Israel. So the U.S. did not arm Israel in 48. Not only that, it didn't start supplying arms to Israel until after 67. The country in between was France in the 50s and 60s. So that's an important corrective if we're going to begin to understand the role of the United States in the Middle East and its relationship to Israel. We should understand that this is not the case in which the U.S., Zionism, and Israel were linked hand in hand from the beginning. That's not how it unfolded. Why the U.S. was cool or ambivalent towards Israel from the outset is an interesting subject in and of itself. But I would just say that its understanding of its imperial interests were anti-Zionist, or at least that was true from many people. And on the other hand, Israel pursued a non-aligned foreign policy in its early years, something that the United States did not appreciate. So I wanted to just address that. As far as your question goes, I didn't mean to say that Zionism was natural. I don't know if it was natural or not. I meant only to say that there were multiple responses to the problems I described. Zionism was one of them. There were at least two others. There is, let's say, the standard Marxist view in Europe, which is to say Jews aren't a nation. They are a dying caste. And that this is fine, this is good, that the forces of capitalism coupled with equal rights will function to absorb Jews into the larger population. And again, that's nothing to fear, it's nothing to object to, it's actually something to celebrate. This is the natural part of capitalism's workings, as well as legal emancipation, so that those, whether they were Bundists, socialist Zionists, or some other thing, they were dividing the working class. They were romantic dreamers. They were hopeless. They were any number of things, but they were not progressive. So assimilation was another response. Was that natural or not? I don't know. Most Jews objected to this, but not all Jews objected to this. Leon Trotsky didn't object to this prior to the 30s, but during the 30s, Trotsky started to revise this and move towards a territorial solution towards the Jewish question. In the 30s, it became very difficult for leftists Marxists to maintain the traditional assimilationist, anti-Jewish nationalist view. So that coming out of the 40s in this country, almost no Marxists accepted it anymore. They were saying we were wrong. We were just wrong about it. We predicted one thing and we got genocide. There were other solutions as well, and this relates to your class question. In the United States, the social base for Zionism in the Jewish community was working class to middle class mostly. That's also most of the Jewish population
in the United States.
In the United States, yeah, was working class to middle class. The wealthiest stratum in the Jewish community tended to reject Zionism. And to understand that, you have to understand that for them, the goal that they had pursued since the 18th century was what I would call liberal integrationism. give us equal rights. We will integrate fully into this country, or England or Germany or France, and we will redefine ourselves as a religious confession. We are Americans of the Jewish faith. That's all we are. And they objected to Zionism strongly. They saw what they disliked about Zionism is its ethnic definition of Jewishness, often a secular, non-religious definition of Jewishness. And Zionists, among others, sought to democratize the Jewish community. The bourgeoisie, the Jewish bourgeois elements opposed the democratization of the Jewish community. So there was a confrontational dimension to that. Poland, I think maybe you had Poland in mind, or at least some other European countries in mind when you wanted to clarify if I was talking about the United States or elsewhere. But the array of options in different countries tended to vary. Poland and the US weren't the same. Germany and Poland weren't the same, to say the least, prior to the 1930s and so on. But this is to just try to answer the question. So I know I don't see Zionism as natural. It was simply one of multiple solutions put forward.
Okay. I guess just before we open the floor for Q&A, there seemed to be in Tony's remarks and also in Gabe's remarks, this kind of recognition of a sort of Stalinism going on.
How did you get that from what I said?
Well, the necessity for like a secular politics and how that kind of shifted.
I don't think I suggested anything about.
I just mean like the question of like how it came from, at one point, Marxists like Lenin and Trotsky recognized the sort of conflicts around the ideas of national liberation, but I don't think that they necessarily affirmed them necessarily. But I guess my question is, how has the left played a part in shaping the way that we think about these things, namely in the categories of settler colonialism? Do we fall below the ideals of the past, namely of Marxism, and an insistence of a secular politics? How do you see the ghost of Stalinism and the League of Nations haunting the current conversation? And in some ways, how does talking about this, I think Tony's remarks kind of reminded me of something that a member of ours, Richard Rubin, on a different panel, where he says, and I'll quote, after all, the deeply tragic character of Zionism stems from its Janus-like character. To the Palestinians, it was and is a colonial settler movement, but to the Jews, Zionism presented itself as a movement of national liberation for an oppressed people. It is customary to focus on one side of this, the colonial settler side, to delegitimize Zionism, and the other, the national liberation movement, to legitimize it. But I am emphasizing that both are integral to it. And so I guess just like, if you had any like comments or about the questions that I was posing.
Yeah, well, I mean, as far as Stalinism is concerned, I don't use that term myself. I use the term communist, and then there's various, positions and figures within that movement. Although I do recommend that everyone read Joseph Stalin's seminal text, Marxism and the National Question. It's highly relevant to this. And that, what was the other? Yeah, and then as for the quotation from Mr. Rubin, as is probably apparent from my earlier comments, I flatly reject the notion that Zionism is a national liberation struggle. That's ridiculous. Sorry, excuse me. I don't mean to get too spicy, but I don't agree with that at all. So that's pretty much what I think of that in a nutshell. I mean, it is spitball a little bit. I mean, I think it's, and part of the reason why I think the national Stalin on the national question is worth reading is because it elucidates like the problem that the Russian communists are trying to deal with at the time, which is that they are inheriting the Russian Empire, which was a very violent empire, a prison house of nations, as Lenin referred to it. And they're trying to come up with a viable political solution that's implementable. It doesn't work to just say, oh, everyone be nationless. So you have to come up with a solution. And the solution they came up with was national self-determination within the Russian Empire. What does that require? It required a definition of the nation. Stalin has a famous 4-part definition that's basically rooted in the material facts of a people with a shared culture in a particular area and a shared economy. And then, now how do Jewish people in the then Russian Empire fit into that? I mean, I think, and this is referenced in Marxism and the national question, but a lot of the skepticism towards Zionism from the communists came from this fact that it sounded like the sort of assertion of a non-material romantic idea of nationhood predicated on a sort of organic unity of the folk. This is the Volkish ideal. I'm sorry. Anyway, so.
Tony?
About Stalin, I don't know what to say. I mean, so in the history of Jewish nationalism, Stalin plays a kind of oddly ambiguous role because, like all Bolsheviks, he opposed the very idea of a Jewish nation, again, expected them to assimilate. On the other hand, he and the other Bolsheviks inherited an empire. So they adopted a Jewish national policy very, very quickly. The Soviet government legally identified Jews as a nation, almost very, very quickly. And they implemented, you could say, a modified form of what the Bund wanted, ironically. That's why half the Bund joined the Bolsheviks. It was one of the reasons why half the Bund joined them. At the same time, under Stalin, actually, the Soviet Union it creates the Jewish autonomous region of Azerbaijan. It doesn't go anywhere. It fails. But the very fact that the Soviet Union under Stalin adopts a territorial solution is yet a second reversal. And from the Jewish perspective, from the perspective of many Jews, Stalin at first seems like an interesting guy. He seems like he is accepting the Jewish, he's applying the nationality principle that the Soviet Union is applying to multiple nationalities that you referred to the Jews. And then when you jump to the 40s, he supports the state of Israel. I mean, not just supports it. It's the Soviet Union in May of 47 that gives, under Gromyko, the Soviet UN ambassador, gives a very powerful speech to the UN saying, maybe because of fascism, because the Western powers couldn't protect the Jews, and because England is failing in Palestine, maybe, just maybe, there should be Jewish statehood and Arab statehood. I mean, that's what sets us going. The U.S. starts to get very worried about this. But the other side of Stalin is that he dismantles Yiddish national institutions already by the late 30s. And then, of course, in the 40s, 50s, he's implementing a strategy. He becomes anti-Semitic. So Stalin's this ambiguous figure, as Jews are seeing it at the time. Mm-hmm. That's all I can really say for the moment about Stalin.
I guess I was just, because you kind of posed the question of like how Trotsky opposed like a sort of Jewish cultural identity versus Stalin, who you said right now had a kind of ambiguous stance on the creation of Israel, but then supported it. So maybe you can speak on like what the shift was.
So that's the kind of in a broad, very quick thumbnail sketch, the Stalin piece. Trotsky Trotsky is, again, not unusual at all. There are many Russian and German and Polish and Romanian and so on Jewish revolutionaries. Rosa Luxemburg's another one, great example of this approach of saying, I happen to be born a Jew. It means nothing to me. And the future of the Jewish people is that they don't have a future, and that's progressive and so forth. I mean, it's hard not to see this as kind of anti-Semitic today, but I urge you not to. It's not anti-Semitic. There's shortcomings in this. Luxemburg could be, I think, quite callous towards the suffering of Jews, but it's not an anti-Semitic position. In fact, these people opposed anti-Semitism. They also opposed nationalism. They were both. And Trotsky was like that. You know, he famously said in response to a question, do you see yourself as a Jew or a Russian? And he said, neither. I'm a social democrat, meaning a Marxist. That was his answer. I'm neither. Now, of course, you could say this is silly. He's born into a Jewish family and he's born in Russia. I mean, but he's trying to, and he knows this is true, so it's not silly. What he's trying to do is say, it doesn't matter where I come from or what nation I belong to. I adhere towards an ideology of class liberation that transcends national boundaries. And I respect that. I mean, I disagree with it, but I absolutely respect it in its time and place. I also respect Trotsky for saying, look, I was wrong. He says it in the 30s already. I was wrong. We and others, we expected a decline in anti-Semitism. We have an increase in anti-Semitism. We expect the Jews to assimilate, but they're actually building national cultures in places like Poland and Palestine. And so he starts to modify his view, and more Trotskyists will do it in the 40s. All these, the way I see it, is we're talking about in the first half of the 20th century, a time when, you know, the situation is so complex for Jews and, you know, everybody, and it's not clear who's right. I mean, every argument, the way I see it, I've come to see it, you know, is that everyone, every party in some way is saying something correct because they're looking at a complex reality and they can marshal evidence to say, yeah, if you give Jews equal rights in Russia, they'll become like the French. That's Lenin. You know, they'll be equal citizens, they'll become incorporated into the larger society and they'll disappear. And there's evidence to say that. You know, or you can say, you're totally out of your mind. Look what's actually happening. Jews are being pauperized. They're being turned into a massive underclass. And the violence against them is happening as the class struggle is proceeding. This is one of the arguments of socialist Zionists. The class struggle is heightening anti-Semitism. It's not solving it. You can absolutely find ample evidence that that's true, and we can go on. This is why I would say all these competing solutions, whether it's Luxemburgian or Trotskyian or Stalin or Lenin or on, have to be taken seriously in their times and places. Right. And then after a while, you can say, all right, you know, Jews have been annihilated. You have a mass refugee population. No one is letting them in. And this is why almost everyone on the left says they want to go to Palestine, they should go to Palestine, they should have national rights there. It's a matter of trying to reconcile Jewish national rights with Palestinian Arab national rights. How are we going to do it? That's why so many people in the 40s converge at the same place through different routes.
Okay, we'll open it up for questions. Pam?
Yeah, April, you brought up this concept of revolutionary defeatism, and Bill, you talked about what leftists in the United States can do, and I think both of you agreed that there was a responsibility for leftists to fight imperialism, and Gabriel, you said that right now the Palestinian struggle is a dagger on the side of American imperialism. So I had a question about this, because something that it brings up is the history of the Iranian Revolution and the left's response to that struggle at the time, to consider it as a kind of anti-imperialist struggle without assessing the kind of forces that would go to the forefront if that struggle were to win. And so I wonder to what extent revolutionary defeatism, the idea of turning the imperialist war into a civil war in the beginning of the 20th century, was taking into consideration the forces of the left in the world in order to take up that opportunity, whereas the position in 1977 seemed to be the left shooting itself in the foot. When the anti-imperialist forces won, they killed the communists. And to what extent are we more in the latter moment of the absence of a left in the world? To what extent are we more in the early 20th century moment of turning the imperialist war into a civil war? And does that matter in how we espouse this principle? Does it matter that we have an absence of the left? Or do we then think that perhaps any anti-imperialist force in the world is a win for the left? How do we make sense of this? And then my second question was building off of Itzi's original question about the ghost of Stalinism and Tony's really helpful history, because I thought that Tony's history showed how there were changes in the positions by left forces and reversals in the 20th century vis-a-vis what they thought was possible and necessary, and then the reality of that struggle once it was ongoing. And so when you talked about Trotsky's conception of the Federation, of the Arab Jewish Federation in the Middle East, what was that? I guess I want you to talk more about that, and what does that mean? What kind of position would that be to take today? Would that be entirely unrealistic? And are we just bound to repeat the framework of the nation state? And do we really need to be Marxists to talk about nationalist liberation? Do we need to be socialist at all? Aren't we just repeating the kind of framework of Wilsonian democracy? What does it mean to be a Marxist today and be for national liberation?
I'm eager to hear their responses, but could I ask you just for one clarification? Yeah. With benefit of hindsight, what should the American left have done in 1977 when the Shah was being when there was a mass uprising against the Shah? What position should the American left have taken?
I don't know. I think that maybe it should have been a question of the world left, not the Americans versus the Iranian left, right? Because then we accept the national framework that the left is a nationalist phenomenon. Certainly should have asked itself, I guess, what does it mean for the enemies of imperialism to win?
So thank you for the question. It's a good question. And I think this is probably going to get to what you're getting at, but the point of my comments and my connecting it to the position of revolutionary defeatism is basically that these kinds of questions of, what about the perspective of the world left are precisely the kinds of questions that I think are unanswerable and maybe even unaskable obviously you did ask it, but it's hard for me to compute. I really don't even know what it would mean to say the position of the world left. The reality is that you have lots of proximate political struggles. So there's the question in 1977, what should the American left have been doing in response to the protests against the Shah? That's a question you can ask, and there might be an answer to it. What should be the position of a world left, to me, is an abstraction that isn't real. So the point is that it's always a practical orientation. So if I'm rambling. Okay, if you're an American communist, and by American I mean person residing in the United States of America, your task is to advance the revolutionary struggle in the United States of America. And so the question is always how to do that. And when you have, say, US imperialism facing obstacles, the point is, what do you do with that? So the point is to make an objective analysis of the situation and try to find out what kinds of splits is this causing in our ruling class? How can we use this to intervene in our particular context so that the left does win in our particular context? That's the point. So anyway, I hope that's clear to people. Is that making sense?
Clear to me. Yeah.
Okay. Sorry. But thank you for the question.
Well, my view is that there's been a certain problem that's persisted now for about a century, and that is there are two nations who are both claiming some form of national rights. This is what they want. And it seems to me that the task of the left should be to help secure that in the short term, and then try to imagine in the long term how these two things can evolve. As I said, nowadays people still talk about my nationalism. People talk about confederalism, some sort of confederation of two states or two nations within a single state. People talk about, again, the old partition idea, 2 states for 2 nations, again, which might evolve into something different over time. And then there are powerful forces on both sides that deny the other side has any national rights or should even be allowed to live there. My own view is that the left should try to accommodate the national aspirations of both communities, and then what happens over time we don't know. But to try, if we're talking about what the left should do, should be to achieve that short-term goal, and then help guide the future in cooperation with the people who live there towards a peaceful coexistence and possibly an interdependence, if that's the right word. That's what I would say. Now, I understand that this doesn't sound. I understand that there are various reasons why leftists might object to this. There's more than one, probably. But I think this is already a tall order, and quite ambitious, and the only way to protect Palestinians and Jews so they may thrive in all respects.
I have a question for you all, because one of the things that's roiling this country right now is what's going on in the academy. What's going on at Northwestern? Are you guys being shut down? Are you allowed to put notes on your door? Barnard College just outlawed anyone putting notes on their dormitory door. And, and meetings are not allowed to happen, and professors are being censured. And I'm just curious, is Northwestern not in any upheaval about this? And if you are, why aren't we being picketed or something here? Is there anything going on here? No.
I guess I can speak to that. There's definitely activity at Northwestern around protests around the situation in Palestine, the violence in Gaza, but for better or for worse, institutional limitations haven't been super extraordinary. There have been, conflicts around committees that have been formed and whether they're more or less amenable to Palestinian political support versus Jewish or Zionist support on campus, but especially compared to a lot of the other universities around the United States, at least Northwestern has been fairly lax.
Did you say lax?
Yeah, there was one moment where there was a lax in terms of restricting speech on campus,
Okay.
I guess. There was one moment where two students were they had charges leveled against them for like publishing like a fake version of the campus newspaper, but those charges were.
Oh, I read about that. But are you alarmed about what happened at Harvard to the president of Harvard? And nothing like that is happening here? No big splits in the administration with the board? Okay,
You should
good.
ask the next question. You had your hand up.
I just had a quick question. Because we were talking about like different standpoints being valid for their time and place, and I was just wondering what kind of standpoint or solution you think would be appropriate to the current time and place, given that there's effectively an apartheid regime and genocide being conducted. It seems to me that the only humane solution would be a one-state solution. It actually seemed really abstract to even suggest moving forward with the intention of cooperation, given the openly hostile standpoint of our own government, and they fund the military with genocidal practices. So I guess it's an open question to all the families.
Go ahead, Gabe.
I mean, yeah, I don't know. I think I share your reservations about any proposed two-state solution. Again, this is really, I'm no like geopolitics or Middle East expert, but it does seem to me like the history of illegal occupations in Palestinian territory has made it such that a two-state solution is maybe really not practicable anymore. So it does seem to me, like if I'm imagining what would be a sort of conceptually viable outcome, it would be a one-state solution that is a democratic and non-ethno-nationalist state. Now, again, there's like a revolutionary struggle going on in Palestine right now, and unfortunately, for better or for worse, these things play out of their own accord, and I'm not sure that we here at this juncture have a whole lot of impact or say in how that goes.
Again, I think it's not two states. I said before, the two-state solution has been resurrected as kind of a look over there and ignore what's really happening, because the two-state solution was dead in the water in the 80s. And the reason it was dead was because Israel and the United States would not have it. And it's that simple. So they came up with this. Nobody was, no one from the Israeli or United States side was going to allow a sovereign state with all the rights and responsibilities of a state. They undermined it starting right from the beginning. So, but I'm open to a two-state solution if that's what the people there decide. What I think we have to grapple with is we're in a new situation, which is the mask of Zionism as a benign kind of, it just kind of rumbling along. It's kind of democratic. It's kind of our friend. That mask has been ripped off. It's a racist state. It's an aggressive, ethnically cleansing all the time. It's been the goal. It's been the goal of the Netanyahu. People complain when we say from the river to the sea, Palestine will be free. That is, from the river to the sea is in Netanyahu's political program. From the river to the sea, it's going to be a Jewish state. They've been working on that. They believe in that. That's what they're working toward. Our job, because we have a particular job, because we're in the US, our job is to oppose our imperialism enabling a genocide right now. And all the language that they're using, all the mythology that's pumping out from the Biden administration, from the capitalist media, we need to oppose it. Again, I salute JVP, SJP, the Palestinian community in general, for really being remarkable in their intensity and their courage to call what it is what it is. You wanted to add something?
I think, what some of the basic facts of the reality in Israel is that there's the vast majority of the population constitute a nation, a Jewish nation, and they don't want to, and they have no intention of giving up their national rights. You have some smaller parts of the population who aren't Jews, the Druze, for instance, and at least portions of the Bedouin community that aren't Jewish, but identify with the Israeli state, serve in the army. Even now, some of those who call themselves Palestinian Arabs in Israel serve in the army. Not a lot, don't get me wrong. I don't want to overstate this. I'm talking about a small number. But I'm trying to make the point that there's a state in which there's a majority nation. There are smaller ethnic groups, maybe even national groups, that are citizens of the nation. And some of them even identify with Israel as it's constituted. Then we have Palestinians outside of the state of Israel, occupied territory, so forth. They also are striving for national liberation. So how, in the most practical terms, how do you convince millions of people that they don't have national rights? And if you can't convince them, how are they taken away from them? Especially because this is recognized. So first of all, this is recognized internationally. The United Nations that established the state of Israel and welcomed it into the body, and all the countries around the world who recognized Israel quite quickly in the late 40s into the 50s. And again, that aside, the fact is that they exist. So if we're talking, about practicality, that's the first question that comes into my mind.
But the problem, Tony, with that presentation is that's the argument about facts on the ground. And I don't know what the solution is. I really don't know. But this is exactly what the Netanyahu war cabinet is saying. Facts on the ground are going to make the West Bank part of Israel, are going to make Gaza. They're talking about settlements right now in Gaza. So, the fact is that if you have any international standard that's got to do with equity and equality, then if this person has a right living in Brooklyn to bring your cousin and be a citizen of Israel, then this person who has a person living in Beirut should have the exact same right. And without equality, and as I say, an apartheid system, and it is apartheid. Anybody who in this country who opposed Jim Crow, who understood and saw it for what it is, go there. You'll see it in a minute. Ta-Nehisi Coates went there earlier in the summer, and he said, I've been told my whole life, it's so complicated. It's just so complicated. I got there and there was nothing complicated about it. It was Jim Crow. My parents told me about it. I'd seen it, and that's what it is. So that's what has to be undone. And to me, today's crisis, brutal, painful, horrible for so many people, and everywhere in that region. But the one thing that I think is happening is that the benign, innocent idea that Israel is an innocent state, Zionism has been exposed. Gabe brought up the South African move in the International Court of Justice. It's being exposed. And so you're right, the UN recognized it. And it's also true that Israel has been an outlaw state since the 60s. And every time the world tries to bring it to face its crimes, the U.S. is the one group that stands in its way. And the latest, there was a great cartoon of Biden and Blinken in the Oval Office wringing their hands. And what are we going to do? The Palestinians are starving. What should we do? And Blinken says, "Oh, I've got it. Let's veto another UN resolution." That's what they do. And the last UN resolution they vetoed, no one joined them. Even Great Britain, abstained. We are all alone in the world propping up this illegal nasty, segregationist, Jim Crow, apartheid state.
But that's not true. I mean, Israel's relations with the Arab world is, on the whole, only improved in the last 20 years. Israel's relations with India since the 1990s is very close, whether we like India or Saudi Arabia or Jordan or whoever. It's not, that's a separate question. If the question is whether Israel's treated as a pariah state, it's on the contrary. Israel's standing in the world has only grown stronger in terms of trade, diplomatic relations, and so forth.
Not since October 7.
None of these countries that I just named are calling for Israel's destruction.
Israel's destruction wasn't on the table just now. No, but
or
Egypt
its eradication, or its
transformation. It's into a state that allows equal rights for everybody.
Was the end of apartheid in 1994 in South Africa the eradication of the South African state?
And Israel are two fundamentally different cases.
Well, of course, but the
That's
systems
your
are.
opinion.
Okay, I think we should ask another question. Ben?
Yeah, so, Ayers, you raised the years specifically, and so I want to jump on it in terms of like the 67 moment, I'll speak louder, sorry. In the context of 1967, I think that it's a notable moment if you expand the period more broadly to the late 50s to the early 70s. It's sort of characterized at the global scale by this wave of decolonial movements. In the late 60s, you have the anti-war movement, the sort of student left, all of these sort of phenomena that are really grounded on these terms. And so, in conjunction maybe with the end of Pam's question around the relationship of the left to national liberation, what I wonder is, today, are there lessons to be learned about the history of that left in that period? Israel and its relationship to Palestine are much closer today to 67 than maybe 67 was to like 1948. And so what I wonder, I suppose, is in the context of the PLO forming in the mid-60s, a left which on the whole becomes something more popularly oriented towards national liberation, these sort of ideas. What can that teach us today? Are there lessons to be followed or avoided? Yeah, and of course, I think this is something that all three panelists can speak to, but I'm wondering about Ayers.
Well, say a little more. I mean, lessons for today. The PLO was founded, yes, and there were other organizations that were founded at the same time. And the U.S. and Israel systematically destroyed them all, including the PLO, right? And just as the United States and Ronald Reagan built up Al-Qaeda, Israel and the United States built up Hamas as an alternative to the PLO. So they've destroyed all these organizations, and I'm not sure what...
I think Ben's question was trying to get at what lessons could we learn from the student anti-war movements of the 60s?
That's a part of it, yeah.
I'm not sure. Well, I mean, what can we learn? First of all, I'll take up the premise. There is no such thing as the 60s. Nobody lives by decades, and nobody said on December 31st, 1969, oh shit, it's almost over, let's go get high. We did go get high, but it wasn't because anything was over. And I think that mythology is part of what kind of grinds down generation after generation of radicals in this country, because the 60s was so perfect that everybody knew what they were doing. That's utter bullshit, and nobody should believe in the 60s, number one. Number two, we did believe in the Third World Project. So some of us, Bernie and I certainly did. Just as leftists at the turn of the last century, believed that an uprising in Russia, for example, in Germany, could create a socialist society. By the time we were young radicals, the socialist project had been kind of discredited in many ways, and the Third World Project was rising. We found ourselves in deep support of that project, which meant, as Gabe was saying, I think it's a principle, and I think it's a lasting principle, that in the mother country, the role of leftists is to oppose the imperial center and to support self-determination for the peoples who are oppressed by that imperial center. I still believe that. But it is also true that the Third World Project has also fallen on terribly hard times, corruption being one thing, but the relentless neo-imperialism being another thing. So I'm not sure what more to say, except that I do think everyone in this room should feel a deep urgency to oppose our government's role today in a pre-announced, pre-planned, executed genocide. We can see it. It's not a mystery.
Anyone else?
What was the question? The 60s?
Don't talk.
Is there something to be learned from the 60s? Is there a parallel that can be drawn to today?
Oh, I don't know. The Beatles are overrated, and the 60s died in 1971 with Iggy and the Stooges. Yeah. I don't know, man. I don't know. Yeah. Maybe come back to me or something.
Tony?
I'm afraid I can't. It's too big for me to get my. The 60s, as Bill said, is so many things.
That's what Bernanke was saying. The best politics, the best rock and roll, the best sex. It's all still good.
Although I will say I love Iggy and the Stooges. I do think the Beatles are overrated. And yet at the same time, the period between 64 and 68 is probably unparalleled when it comes to music. I'm sorry? Something happened that it's worth another project, but someone explaining what happened in America that produced that 4-year period in music. James Brown is
we shouldn't move on to the next question.
No, let's talk about music.
But if I can just emphasize, I think, Ben, and you can correct me here, is that there is like a sense of a repetition in our moment, a repetition of the 60s and the 70s, especially with the emphasis on third world movements and third world liberation movements.
Specifically as a means toward like the struggle for socialism.
Right. And I don't know if there's much you guys have to say about that. Or...
Can I just make some comments? And it's nothing more than tentative thoughts that I would say makes this period different from the 60s. One, the economy is not robust. That period of post-war expansion, however it expanded, whether it was through war production or other way, whatever, that period that extended from roughly 45 to 73, that was very important then, and I don't think much can be understood about the 60s without that framing. That's not the case today. First difference, I would say. Second difference is, and this is part of the first, is there was an expanding student population. And I'm not sure it's expanding today, or at least expanding at the same rate. I could be wrong, but that's a thought. The third, if I can just say one more thing about this, I think there's a crisis, although many people in the 60s did see a crisis in liberalism, and there was to some degree, American liberal with a small L institutions and values were sturdier in the 60s than they are now. My God, even Goldwater wasn't Trump. And so I think the edifice of American institutions which I think are wobbly now, I think differentiate the present moment from the 60s. So I tend to see differences, but where to take those differences, I'm not.
Well, Gabe said that the ruling class is on its back foot. He said that a minute ago. But I'm not sure exactly what you all are worrying about or warning against, because I agree with you that there's many things have changed. One of the things that changed is that U.S. imperialism is in decline, and I think that it's very shaky. I think the other thing that's happening is that the Black Freedom Movement, which is a centuries-old movement, has had a recent upsurge that has defined so many things, including Israel-Palestine. I think that's part of why there's such a quick reaction to this genocide, is that the Black movement has been united in opposing Israeli aggression. So I think there's a lot changed. The other thing, if you think about the corresponding crises that we're facing and the kind of coming together of crises, fascism is a very real possibility in this country. And that's something that was not true until quite recently. I think it's real. I think it's on the rise. I think there's always been a white supremacist base in this country, but I've never seen it as well organized, as pointed as it is right now.
It's well armed.
I'm sorry?
And as well armed.
And as well armed. So this is a very different and dangerous situation. The other crisis that we should mention, not only a crisis in kind of truthiness, but a crisis of government legitimacy, and add to it all the crisis of catastrophic capitalist climate collapse. That is huge, and it's different than anything we've ever faced before. And so I think that these are new elements. I don't think these are things that you can point backwards and say they did this. But I hear you warning against being too third world oriented. I don't see it. I don't see, first of all, there's not a robust left here that you can point to and say, oh, the left thinks. I don't see it that way. But you seem to be warning us against repeating the mistakes of the League of Nations or Stalin or something. I don't see it.
I hope that's not how my question comes across, because it's not just saying like what went wrong, but rather is our moment utterly irreconcilable to the memory and legacy of the 20th century? Are there things that the left and its activities historically can speak to for what we should be doing now? I don't think that I'm making a judgment necessarily in that question.
So, first of all, I think it's a crucial question for leftists. Are the legacies we've inherited. And the legacies include problems as well as insights and successes, victories. So one thing I would say, sorry, this might reflect my personality, but I think the problems from coming out of the 60s, 70s that the left has to deal with is a couple. One is the social democratic compact of the post-war period. Regulation of capitalism, massive social investment, maybe industrial investment, within a highly regulated capitalist system with a generous welfare state, with, again, Western European countries is a model for social democrats. That collapsed in the late 70s. Collapse might be too strong, but it ran aground in the late 70s, for sure, right. And that hasn't changed. I don't think that's changed. It's not clear how the post-war social democratic approach of, again, massive spending and all these other things, right, is possible in a neoliberal world. It might be, but I think that's a problem that has to be dealt with on the left. We have to deal with that somehow. Capital flight is something that I think any serious socialist has to reckon with. And if a social democratic approach is not possible, then what is? I think I know what you're going to say. So in other words, are we back to an earlier Marxist revolutionary approach? So those are a couple questions about what the past, is. What are the things that keep me awake at night? Everything that Bill said a few moments ago keep me awake at night. I would say, for those who think in revolutionary terms, the problem of let's say, the notion of a vanguard party and a proletarian dictatorship. Sorry now, this is going to sound too arcane, but these, I think, are actually not dead questions. Because there's a question of how so does a party need a majority of the population? If not, how do you seize power? How do you retain power? How do you govern? If you have a transitional government that is a dictatorship of the proletariat, how long does that transition last? What are the constraints placed on it? Are there any constitutional constraints placed on it? These I think, are not outdated, dusty questions. I actually think they're perennial questions, if you will. I see some of these as really, really important. And now there is an accumulation of writings about these that happened throughout the 20th century, coming from multiple directions. Anarchists Marxists, different kinds of Marxists, Leninists, Trotskyists, Social Democrats, libertarian socialists. I mean, there are all kinds of people that have been grappling with, I believe, are fundamental questions of socialism. And in a time of great danger that Bill has suggested,
But the crisis of capitalism you describe really does open to, a couple of alternatives come right to mind, and one is fascism.
Yeah.
And the fascist movement in this country is a response to the crisis in capitalism.
Yes. Yeah.
Who's not responding to the crisis in this country is the left primarily. They're not very well organized or armed.
That's right.
But that's on us.
Why not? Oh, never mind.
Ben?
Yeah, I have a question for each of the three panelists. So for Tony, my question was, what role did the left among Jews in Israel before and after 1948 play or contribute to, or alter in some way the current day ethnic definition of statehood? Like, what role did the left among Jews play in that in Israel? And then my question for Gabriel, in your opening remarks, you said that there's a new, and this relates to the discussion that you guys are just having right now, which is that there's a new political opportunity now. And how you put it in your opening remarks was that there's a new opportunity to crisis the delegitimization of U.S. imperialism over Israel-Palestine. So my question was, how is that different from any number of the recent delegitimizations of the U.S. In the recent past, like for example, the catastrophe of the Iraq War or the election of Trump was also a delegitimization of U.S. imperialism. So what's different? What's new now? Just in terms of the delegitimization of U.S. imperialism. You guys were talking about other new crises that are occurring now. And then for Bill, my question was, in your opening remarks, you talked about the slogan of a ceasefire. You're affirming that that's an adequate, or there should be a slogan for a ceasefire and further demands placed on top of that. My question is, what's the significance of a slogan for a ceasefire? Why is ceasefire as a slogan now, especially given that now we have Hamas and Netanyahu and Kamala Harris all demanding a ceasefire?
So first, I have to say I'm not an expert in Israeli history, but I'm going to try to answer the question the best I can. Prior to 48.
Or after.
Okay, I'll even attempt that. There are competing understandings of what a Jewish nation, the political forms a Jewish nation should take in Israel, Palestine. And those evolved over time and in competition with one another on the various groupings of the Zionist left. A couple I referred to before. One, statehood. Another, autonomy. Another, binationalism. Another, just let's not deal with this. Let's just build socialism and keep building socialism as long as we possibly can, independent of a nation state. Keeping in mind, again, the different streams in Zionist socialism. You have anarchist streams, you've got Marxist streams, you've got sort of Marxist informed, but not quite Marxist streams. You've got all these different streams on the Zionist left. To give you a sense of how open the debate was between, let's say, 1905 roughly, which is when a jump in the number of Jews moved to Palestine, and especially the socialists, who will become hegemonic. This is very important. I haven't said this yet. The socialists are the hegemonic group in Palestine by the 1920s. So this is talking about the central players and what becomes Israel. To give you a sense of how open things were, the Zionist organization doesn't declare Jewish statehood as its official goal in 1942. It's fairly late. Now, clearly people are thinking in those terms prior to 42, but still there's an open debate. There's a book I'd recommend. I think it's called Beyond the Nation State. The author is an Israeli scholar named Dmitry Shumsky, and he tells this history really well. Okay, so that's the first point I want to make, that there's this ongoing, so the concerns of Zionist socialists about the question of statehood are manifold. One, they see it's unrealistic. There aren't that many Jews. Contrary to the settler colonialist model, these Jews are not representing a mother country. So there was a fairly small number of Jews who don't have a powerful country backing them. England will eventually permit the establishment of a Jewish national home, only to do a reversal in 1939. So that's one consideration of the Zionist left. It's its own limited, highly limited power. Second, it's an acute awareness that there is a majority of the population falling within the borders of Ottoman Palestine, then British Mandatory Palestine. Their numbers are large, they're the majority, and growing mostly through a natural increase in birth, but some migration into Palestine. Many people are growing, and that Jews have to reach an accommodation with them. So that's the second factor in this discussion of debate within Zionism and statehood. The third has to do with socialism. What is the best way to achieve Jewish national liberation? So that's yet another question. So all these questions were debated. The day-to-day activity in creating what will become Israel is built around several institutions. One are the communal farms, the communes, the kibbutzim. That's one. Second, cooperatives. The Michels, not communes, but the cooperatives. Third, the all-encompassing labor federation, the Histadrut, which is becomes a strange combination of trade union federation and workers-owned enterprises. That's crucial to building the infrastructure of what will become Israel. So a lot of these things, and then of course there's the genesis of the Israeli army, which takes shape in several different militias. So all these things are being built by the socialists, Zionist left, and others. After 48, the situation changes, and I'll just say this because I've spoken long enough, that the establishment of statehood puts at least a portion of the Zionist left into a crisis, because its conception of itself is not building a state, but building a constantly becoming and self-realizing Jewish working class in a framework of socialist upbuilding and national liberation in a non-state framework. So what happens to that project now that you have a state? Does it undermine socialism? A good number of social Zionists were saying yes. It's actually going to undermine the socialist project. And then you have others who are saying, no, the state is it's a statist conception of socialism. The state is going to be a good book to read on that, this last thing I'm going to say, is Michels, Zion and State, Nation, Class, and the Shaping of Modern Israel. And he applies Lukács to his understanding of how the state becomes reified by the dominant social Zionist party.
Can you remind me your name, please?
Ben.
Ben. So you asked what's new now, and in what sense is this a new political opportunity?
Yeah. What's the new, or you were saying that this is a new delegitimization of U.S. imperialism that provides a new political opportunity for forming a vanguard party or party movement now. So what's new about this moment rather than 2016 or the aftermath of Iraq when U.S. imperialism was delegitimized for that reason?
Sure. Yeah. So first, I never referred to a delegitimization of U.S. imperialism. I referred to a weakening of U.S. imperialism. These are different things. Delegitimization is like a sort of mental thing, like, people perceive it as less legitimate. I don't think really. I mean, those who are having U.S. imperialism inflicted on them, I think, tend to not view this as legitimate. But so, in any case, what's new about Palestine compared to 2016 when Donald J. Trump was elected, compared to or when what moment did you have in mind with the Iraq or Afghanistan war?
Just the fact that it was a catastrophe and it failed.
Yeah, I mean, I think the United States' inelegant and bungled withdrawal from Afghanistan is another symptom of what I am talking about, which is a change, a reduction in the ability of the United States to project military power and economic control around the world. So in a sense, like, what's new about this particular moment? Nothing really, but it's a furtherance of a trend and a particularly notable furtherance of a trend. So my point in referring to Palestine as a dagger in the side of United States imperialism is because Israel is important to United States imperialism, very important. Joe Biden has said, if Israel didn't exist, we'd have to create an Israel. That's because Israel's quite, in a pretty literal sense, like a launching pad for U.S. planes and U.S. bombs, right? So that's why Palestine's a dagger in the side of U.S. imperialism. Now, the point that I was trying to make is that for us here in the United States who are trying to figure out how to undermine U.S. imperialism and are trying to figure out how to build a better tomorrow, this is, we need to be studying what is happening with U.S. imperialism, because when U.S. imperialism loses its grip, this causes political divisions, splits within our bourgeoisie, within our ruling classes. Donald Trump is a symptom of this. Donald Trump is a symptom of splits in our ruling elites, right? And so our task as U.S. leftists is to get organized, start making decisions collectively, start conducting ourselves with discipline, and taking advantage of the political fractures that emerge domestically as a result of our declining ability to project military power globally. Does that answer the question?
I'm sure. I guess this is a bigger question of what is the advantage to be taken from splits in the bourgeoisie? Given that Lenin quote theorizes about the context of a open civil war.
Yeah, well, so somewhere else, Lenin gives 3 conditions that, sort of make for a revolutionary situation. Hopefully memory serves that, number 1 is the existence of sort of spontaneous, large levels of spontaneous grievance and dissent within the population writ large, usually the result of a sort of sharp relative decline in living standards. Condition 2 is the existence of an organized political force that can make revolution. And condition 3 is a conflict within the ruling class. Because when there's a conflict in the ruling class, it undermines the ruling class's ability to govern, right? And so this creates opportunity for other forces to step in and take advantage of that. So are we getting closer to an answer?
I think so.
Did I get the 3 conditions right?
I think you did.
Okay. More broadly, this is a process. The collapse of U.S. imperialism is a process, and we should do what we can to move it along. But just roughly, as I see it, whatever domestic stability we have here in the United States is built upon imperial exploitation one way or another. So if we lose our ability, if our ruling classes lose the ability to, do imperialism to the degree that they have been, the gas stops flowing and the cheeseburgers stop flowing, you got a problem here in the United States. and there's going to be contending political forces. And so it's our responsibility to make sure we're an effective political force.
Say the ceasefire piece again.
What's the significance of you're advocating the use of the slogan around a ceasefire?
Yeah, and the significance is during the 10 years of the U.S. war against Vietnam, 6,000 people, 6,000 Vietnamese a week were being murdered in our name. In 3 years, we had turned, the Black Freedom Movement, GIs coming home, the anti-war movement, had turned the country against the war. Majority opposed the war. We couldn't stop it, and we didn't stop it. The war went on for 7 more years. 6,000 people a week were murdered with no end in sight until it ended, right? So,
how it ended, by the way.
and it ended because the Vietnamese kicked the United States out, and that's an important fact. But the reason a ceasefire is the first reason a ceasefire is an important demand is because 6,000 people a week are being murdered. And that's the reality on the ground. More Palestinians have been killed in the last 5 weeks than in any other horrible moment in Palestinian national history. So we should mobilize as best we can to stop it. We in America are and Europe is also, but those of us here in America are in a good position. And once again, hats off to JVP, SJP, and the Palestinian community, because they have been quick in responding, and they've been relentless and brave. So ceasefire is a mass slogan. We should always be saying permanent ceasefire, because the Bidens and the Harrises are now saying 6-week ceasefire because it tries to take the teeth out of something that's much more basic. We want a ceasefire. We want the killing to stop. We want Israel to stop killing Palestinians. And that should be our bottom line. But the other thing goes to what Gabe was just saying. Where is the school for revolution in this country? Where do we learn about revolution? We learn it by being involved in those spontaneous uprisings. So anyone who thinks that you can sit on a couch in Evanston and figure this stuff out, not that I'm against sitting on a couch and smoking a joint, I'm for it, but it's not where this gets figured out. It gets figured out in struggle, on the ground, in building organizations, in organizing and activism. We should all be there. And I hope you are all there. We are there as often. In fact, we're leaving here and going to the federal building, downtown Chicago, because there is a all-night rally on the night of Joe Biden's speech to say, end the war. The 100,000 votes in Michigan, the 20% of the votes in Minnesota, these things are significant. It's beginning to be a mass anti-war movement. We should join it. We should learn from it.
We'll take one last question, and then we'll do closing remarks along with the responses to the question. Diaz?
Can we as leftists in the U.S. have any opinion about what course of action ought to be taken to arrive at a more adequate solution to Palestinian liberation? It sounded like, and correct me if I'm wrong, that Bill and Gabriel, you feel that we as Americans are not really in a position to be critical of an organization like Hamas. But it seems to me that if Hamas and the Zionist Israeli state are the only political forces in the region, then the right-wing cycle of violence that has brought us to the current barbarism will continue. Wouldn't it be the role of the true left to provide political leadership that brings the Israeli and Palestinian working class together, contra their mutually irresponsible political leadership? Or do we as leftists have a side to take in the current conflict among the existing political leadership?
With the responses, we'll just do closing remarks from everyone as well.
Go ahead, Gabe.
There's a lot to unpack there. For starters, anyone can have whatever opinion they want, It's a free country after all. But in the context of political organizing, who cares? what your opinion is. I mean, maybe if we in the history of the left, you do have a lot of examples of different communist parties or different left groups giving critiques to one another, but those are useful in the context of like one organization speaking to another organization. Me sitting here, some Northwestern University PhD student having an opinion about, what Hamas is doing, really they don't care. They don't care what I have to say, and I have nothing to do with what's going to happen there. So sure, I could have an opinion. You could have an opinion. We can all have an opinion, but from the perspective, if you're asking a question of like, what's a politically salient course of action or a politically salient position, this is besides the point. Now then there was like a bunch of other stuff you said about like a cycle of like right-wing political violence that has resulted in the current barbarism. Do I have that right? Yeah. I mean, so like the right-wing violence is mostly the violence of the Zionist settler state. So that's like the right-wing violence. As for the Palestinian liberation struggle, which, by the way, I don't think it's accurate to say that Hamas and the Israeli state are the only political actors. That's false.
It's not true.
I do think it's maybe more accurate to say that right now Hamas is, the taking a leading role, perhaps the leading role in the Palestinian resistance movement. Now, but I mean, like, hey, the Palestinians have a right to defend themselves. Full stop. And, far be it for me to lecture the Palestinians on the fact that Hamas is a leading factor in that resistance. I mean, one may not like Hamas. I'm not particularly educated on the ins and outs of Hamas and different organizations in Palestine, but that's they have a right to defend themselves, and I don't. We've failed the Palestinian struggle here in the U.S. So I don't think we have a whole lot to say to them that they're going to be too interested in hearing. But we can do something about the state that we do live in, which is the United States of America, which is, pretty consistently, you follow the threads, you get the pins on the cork board, and a lot of the real evil stuff in the world usually comes back to U.S. imperialism. So I really think that that's where our efforts should be focused. I hope that answered the question.
I agree wholeheartedly. And I think that, I don't think, I can look at the events of October 7th and say that was criminal activity. That was terrorism. At least 800 or 900 civilians were killed. Kidnapping is wrong when it happens here and when it happens there. I mean, so I can say that, but I also can look at history and say there's never been an oppressed people that hasn't found in its resistance the need to resort to violence, also use parliamentary means, also use boycotts and so on. Israel and the United States have cut off every other form of resistance. They've destroyed the PFLP. They destroyed the PLO. And it's not so long ago that Yasser Arafat was the big monster terrorist, the scariest guy in the world. Now they wish they had Yasser Arafat. But I think I really agree with Gabe when he says that for a group of American leftists, Marxists, to sit around and think that it's our job to figure out the fine points of how they should resist. I don't get that at all. I think you're wasting your energy. I think we should go down and sit in at the federal building. I think we should all go get arrested. I think we should go out into the streets of Evanston and shut it down after this meeting, if you guys are ready. But I'm just saying that's more important than you trying to figure out in the classroom or in the textbook who's right. And again, if you want to go back 50 years or 60 years, in the height of the war against Vietnam, 6,000 people a week being murdered, our government's being the perpetrator, there were people on the left saying Ho Chi Minh's a sellout. He shouldn't go to Paris. What's he going to Paris for? He should be fighting. And we used to say to them, you want to fight the Vietnamese Revolution to the last Vietnamese life, right? What are you doing? And that, I think, is what we have to ask ourselves. What's our job here? Our government is the main enabler of this genocide. Let's stop our government from doing that. And in the process of stopping that, not only do we rip the mask off Zionism, we rip the mask off the U.S. imperialism. That's an important thing. Let's get busy and do that.
I just got a couple quick piggybacks off that. Also, the cycle of right-wing violence that you referenced to. Much of the Palestinian struggle has been non-violent. I mean, there's marches and protests and the Great March of Return, non-violent stuff happening all the time in Palestine, going back, for a long time. So it's not just a cycle of violence, And
BDS is portrayed as anti-Semitic in this country, and the leaders of Boycott, Divest, and Sanction are in prison in Israel. I mean, they've tried everything, and they are trying everything, and they should.
And then thank you. And one more real quick thing, we can get more specific, than just, U.S. left. This is Northwestern University. I mostly sit in the philosophy department, so I don't really see, but I hear that, Northrop Grumman and Raytheon, and Goldman Sachs, and even McKinsey is a frickin' criminal organization. And they're all here, So what are we doing about that? That's a place to start.
Yep.
All right. Tony?
So picking up on the point that there are various groups and parties among Palestinians, keep in mind that there are Palestinians who are Israeli citizens and there are Palestinians who are not and don't want to be. If you talk to the head of the Israeli Communist Party, who's a Palestinian, self-defined, he does not like Hamas. He understands what Hamas is. It's a hideous, right-wing, fundamentalist group. The left needs to think very seriously about what it means for it to support this group. And for the head of the Israeli Communist Party also last I understand, supports a two-state solution. Just to give you a sense of where, and then you have Palestinians who vote for Zionist parties in Israel. They vote for small, large, right-wing and left-wing parties, right? So Palestinians are a fairly diverse group. There are several different Palestinian parties in Israel itself. There's the Israeli Communist Party, which is Jewish and Arab, although most of its voters come from the Arab community in Israel. Then there's the West Bank with different parties, and then Hamas has exclusively ruled Gaza since 2006, 2007. So I think it would behoove the left to sit down and educate themselves about the Palestinian political map across these three distinct political three different political entities. Because we're dealing with two things. The reason why it would behoove the left to do this is to try and play a constructive role, to figure out who it aligns itself with and who it doesn't, and to figure out what its own values are.
Any other last remarks? Well, thank you all for coming.